37. Natural privilege and cultural death. Romans 9, 9-13. For this is the word of promise. At this time will I come, and Sarah shall have a son. And not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one, even by our father Isaac. For the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth. It was said unto her, The elder shall serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. Romans 9, 9-13. As we have seen, God works against the presumptions of natural privilege. Although other factors were present in Hildebrand's insistence as Pope on priestly celibacy, one was to undermine the prevailing emphasis on natural privilege. The feudal system sought to absorb the Church's offices into its structure and to assign status within the Church in terms of natural privilege. In the Eastern churches, the lower clergy were allowed to marry, but all higher offices were restricted to celibates, to men who were outside the family in feudal systems. The rule of primogeniture was an aspect of this adherence to natural privilege, and one relevant to our text. In some cultures, the firstborn son takes the entire estate. In Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Europe, the firstborn has had a unique status by virtue of his birth. Thus, in England, many a firstborn son of the nobility and royalty has been a major problem precisely because his birth places him in a position of radical security, one which, in effect, gives him the privilege of influence and contempt for parental authority. The firstborn has often had a sacrosanct character. In the Bible, primogeniture is limited. Beginning with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob each in turn set the firstborn aside in order to establish a more godly heir. The chosen firstborn or heir received a double portion in order to enable him to care for the parents. A godly firstborn son could not be set aside because his mother was hated by the father. Deuteronomy 21, 15-17. How extensively the firstborn were set aside by the Hebrews is apparent not only in the patriarchs, but also in the kings, among whom, especially in Judah, it was a minor consideration. Neither David nor Solomon were firstborn sons. The tribe of Levi had the function of a firstborn, a fact of grace, not of birth. The firstborn in Scripture are often not the firstborn by blood, but the firstborn by grace. In brief, natural privilege is negated as an unfailing rule. To deny that natural privilege is inescapably assured of rank and place, but is subject to the priority of grace, is a serious negation of the human order. The examples Paul gives from the patriarchs of the subverting of natural privilege begin with the birth of Isaac, verse 9. Paul quotes Genesis 18:10 and 14 to show that the human condition does not govern God, he governs the human condition. Isaac, who is not the firstborn, is born miraculously. The conception and birth of Isaac are said by God to be his coming onto the scene in action. At this time will I come. Ishmael was a product of the planning of Abraham and Sarah. Isaac represented God's plan. For Sarah, at 90 years of age, to conceive and bear a child was God's sovereign grace, not human privilege and choice. A mere physical connection with Israel is no assurance of a place in the promises of God. It would have been possible had Paul stopped here for some to read natural privilege into the case of Sarah and Isaac. Sarah was, after all, the wife of Abraham, whereas Hagar and Keturah were concubines. In verse 10, Paul shuts the door on this escape route. He cites Rebekah and Isaac and their 2 sons. Both Esau and Jacob were children of the same mother. The choice was sovereign grace. The Greek word translated as conceived is koiten. Bed, literally, Rebekah had bedded down with one, namely Isaac. Man's place in God's plan is God's choice. From before the birth of the twins, God chose Jacob. Human circumstances and natural privilege are deliberately confounded by God. This is stressed in verse 11. Before their birth, God had appointed the destinies of Esau and Jacob. To the last, the descendants of Esau, the Edomites, held to natural privilege. Although faithless, they believed in their quote-unquote right. In fact, Herod saw himself as the promised Messiah, and so presented himself to the people. Acts 12:20-23. Paul insists on the absolute freedom and predestination of God. The twins, before they were born, or had done either good or evil, were appointed by God to their places. This statement is not intended to please man, but to set forth God's sovereignty. Paul leaves man no share in that sovereignty, nor any reason to exalt himself. In verse 12, Paul cites God's statement to Rebekah. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. Genesis 25:23. The word manner is in Hebrew derek, mode, course, or journey. 2 peoples with differing roads or directions are to come forth from Rebekah. Their destinations are different. The word separated is in the Hebrew harad, to divide, spread, sever, and sunder. Until now, Paul's reference to Isaac and Abraham's other sons has been with respect to God's choice of the messianic line. Now it includes more: faith, life, and destiny. No other meaning makes sense. The source of the selection is God himself. Predestination to both salvation and reprobation is clearly taught and stressed here. Both Esau and Jacob as individuals and as peoples, Edom and Israel, are meant. The rejection of Esau was a denial of natural privilege. Israel had come to believe in its own natural privilege by virtue of God's covenant, and Paul is declaring this belief to be wrong. In verse 13, Paul cites Malachi 1, 2, and 3, wherein God declares his love of Jacob and his hatred of Esau. Hatred here means rejection and reprobation, even as love connotes salvation. Paul drives home God's rejection of natural privilege without compromise. He leaves it no standing before God. The fallen world, however, is emphatic on the validity of natural privilege, both before God and before men. To the extent that we allow natural privilege any ground except under God and his grace, to that extent we undermine God's sovereignty and law. To illustrate, in Dr. Howard Halperin's PhD's column, On Your Own, a letter from a young woman, a Christian and a virgin, is cited. The woman makes clear her refusal to assent to fornication and her dismay at the young men and women who engage in it. Halperin disapproves of such a moral and religious attitude. He favours the acceptance of the other person's value system and a respect for it, There should be no confrontation. The girl, on refusing fornication, should say, "This is not a personal rejection, and I hope it doesn't go so counter to your feelings and values that you will want to stop seeing me. But it's important to me to be true to what I believe." Halperin concludes, "This is a much more acceptable, receptive, and likable message than communicating, 'I'm good and pure, and you are bad and indecent.'" Halperin denies implicitly any governing moral law from God, and he affirms man's natural privilege to order his life according to his tastes. Whether in the sphere of personal conduct, state law, or man's relationship to God, natural privilege asserts the autonomy of man from God. Man is seen as free to assert his own standards, and God must accept man on his own self-evaluation. Natural privilege means, however, cultural death. The more deeply entrenched it becomes, the more deadly its consequences. Old China, with its rigid family system, and India with its castes, both represent the development of natural privilege into stagnation and decay. In the world outside of Christ, natural privilege prevails, and with it death. Natural privilege rivets chains upon man and forestalls substantive change and progress. Man's original sin is to be his own God and lawmaker, his own source of good and evil. Genesis 3:5. The tempter's insistence was that instead of a law and requirement coming from and imposed by God, it was man's natural privilege to be his own God and determiner. As Dalberg noted, man is always seeking Eden, and his own counsel was, "Be primordial or decay." For Dalberg, all the errors concerning the human race come from not realizing that man is merely another animal. If man is merely another animal, then his only valid standard is the biological demands of his being, some form of natural privilege. If, however, man is God's creation, man and every aspect of his life must be under God's law word. The totality of man's being, relationships, and world must be God-governed. The fall is man's rejection of God's government and man's assertion of a natural privilege. But natural privilege is a myth, although sometimes a well-established one. The medieval insistence that grace must govern nature was a radical attack on the world of natural man. Rousseau established the priority of Adam over Jesus, and for him, Adam, the natural man, was to replace Jesus, because nature must replace and abolish grace. With the French Revolution, Jacobinism in 1789 made Adam the symbol of the unity of man as against Jesus Christ, the divider of men. Adam became a great messianic figure standing for the end of time, when all men shall meet again. Creation became man's power and prerogative, and Goethe set forth the new premise: Allah need create no longer, we instead create his world. The world of Adam is the world of natural man and natural privilege. Previously, the world of grace commanded the minds of men, and the liturgy of society which held men's being in its music and rhythm was from the Church, whether Catholic or Protestant. Now, it was centred on the life of man, elite man, the man most naturally privileged. In England, for example, dinner among the elites became a liturgy and a ritual, and whether at home or in hot and humid Africa, gentlemen and ladies dressed for dinner. The American painter Whistler once described the English ritual on shipboard during bad weather. He was the lone non-Englishman. All were dressed for dinner, although many were somewhat green and sometimes made their way to the rail to vomit. The women were properly gowned, the men in dinner jackets, and the stewards were behind their chairs in their dinner jackets. The prerogatives and forms of natural privilege were rigorously maintained. In culture after culture, variations of such emphases are commonplace because the governing world is, for humanistic man, this fallen world. The forms of this world's activities take on great importance. Natural privilege is the ruling premise in one form or another. In Marxist countries, we find the great exaltation of the ruling class because there is no countervailing doctrine of grace to limit their power. The same is true of pagan societies of the past. Paul grounds the rejection of natural privilege in the fact of salvation by sovereign grace and predestination. The great festivals of the Old Testament likewise rejected natural privilege. The Day of Atonement and the Sabbath year wiped out past sins, cancelled debts, and a man was stripped of all plans and obligations that might interfere with God's will. Natural privilege was blocked thereby. The world of nature is fallen. The world of revelation is the redemptive order which must work to undermine all the pretensions of the natural world and all its claimed privileges. Christopher Hill cites an example of what the English Restoration of Charles II did to the Church of England. In Wrexham, for example, gentlemen received the sacrament on one Sunday, as we have seen, and the poor on the next. Such a step established natural privilege in the very realm of grace and indicated the extent of the revolution wrought by the Restoration. The world of natural privilege fails to see that this realm of man is God's creation and, historically, a religious product. Gasset described in 1932 the new barbarism arising in the scientific and academic communities, the belief that civilization is there in just the same way as the earth's crust and the forest's primeval. This failure to recognize the supernatural force in history leads to barbarism because it treats as a continuing natural fact, like the air we breathe, the centuries-old advances of Christian faith. To a degree, this is what Rosenstock Hussey also reacted against when he wrote, "Illiteracy and literacy are not opposites. We shall perish if this is not heeded." In the Christmas message of Queen Elizabeth on December the 25th, 1958, I had to listen to the horrid sentence, "Let us enjoy our accumulated civilization." That is the end of the living word, indeed, for what I resented all my life, even for our memory that it had to be treated as a sum and a mere rubbish heap. This now is proclaimed from on high as constituting the universe of the word. Let us defend the harmony of the spheres against any accumulation of civilizations. Christianity is a rejection of the world of Adam and an affirmation of the world of Christ. As such, it is a denial of natural privilege in favor of sovereign grace. The world of Adam is the world of death.